Hello there, Sharks. I'm Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com. Make sure you check them out for all of your poker news. And today we have a hand from High Stakes Duel featuring Phil Hellmuth, the absolute master of the World Series of Poker. He has all the bracelets. Also, the master of heads up sit and goes. He won 7 in a row. Spoiler alert. Before this one, that he lost to Tom Dwan, he's been crushing it. He is playing today against Tom Dwan, who has about $5 million in live tournament earnings, despite the fact that he almost never plays live tournaments. It's pretty good for someone who doesn't play a ton of live tournaments. He probably has infinite in cash game winnings. They are playing for a $200,000 prize. Both players put up $100,000. In this hand, Phil Hellmuth's playing about 50 big blinds deep, 47 big blinds effective, and he has 7-6 offsuit in the small blind, also the button. He opts to limp. This is something that Phil Hellmuth does a lot. He opts to limp in. I have to presume with the idea that he's going to outplay his opponents post-flop. Or just, he wants to think that he has an edge in lots and lots of pots. And if you do have an edge in lots and lots of pots, it actually does make a lot of sense to keep the pots as small as possible. Because imagine Phil Hellmuth wins the pot, imagine just gets like 55% equity out of every pot he plays, both in position and out of position. If that's the case, you want to keep the pots as small as you possibly can. But the problem with this idea is that when you're out of position and your opponent is often raising, well, when you're in position, you're going to over-realize your equity. So what ends up happening if you limp a lot is you play small pots when you are in position and bigger pots when you are out of position, which it starts to get a little bit dicey, because imagine if you are always at an advantage in position and always at a disadvantage out of position on average, you want to play bigger pots in position and smaller pots out of position, right? And limping, to some extent, does the opposite. Whatever, though. Phil Hellmuth limps. He's won 7 in a row before this one. What do I know, right? He limps. Tom Dwan opts to check. Fine. Flop comes Jack 6-3. Tom Dwan checks. In this spot, Phil Hellmuth has to decide what to do. Should he check? Should he bet 2,000, one big blind? Should he bet 4,000? Or should he blast it? Should he bet 10,000 into the 4,000 pot? I want you to pause the video and write what you would do in the comments section below. This is a spot where Phil Hellmuth's hand is pretty good, especially for heads up. If we were playing in a scenario where, let's say, we raise the button and the big blind calls in a 9-handed table, maybe you don't continuation bet here, but heads up, this is a spot where if you bet and get raised, you can very reasonably continue. And also, your 6 is kind of likely to get outdrawn. Notice in this scenario that Tom Dwan's going to have a lot of hands with random overcards that will fold to a bet, like Queen 8 or King 7, right? And you don't really want to give those hands a free card if they would just fold to a flop continuation bet, like they very often will. You may say, but if I bet, aren't the jacks always going to call? Yeah, they will, but also so will the flush draws, so will the 3s, so will the 7-4s, right? A lot of hands that are in pretty bad shape. So this is a spot where I think continuation betting is a pretty strong option. But Phil Hellmuth checks. All right, Phil Hellmuth, here's what you need to do. Go to pokercoaching.com/cbetquiz. At pokercoaching.com/cbetquiz, I have a few questions to test you, to make sure that you are continuation betting appropriately. That said, that's a joke. Phil Hellmuth probably doesn't need my quiz. Maybe you do, though. Check it out, pokercoaching.com/cbetquiz. That said, Phil Hellmuth is known for his magical powers, his white magic, he calls it, where he can just look and tell when his opponent has something. Okay, if that's the case, you definitely do not want to continuation bet here, because you don't really want to get raised, right? And also, if Tom Dwan does just have a jack, then clearly you don't want to be betting, right? So if you are playing live poker and your opponent is an online poker player who has infinite live tells, as many of them do, I'm not saying that's Tom Dwan, but maybe that's what Phil Hellmuth thinks. If your opponent has lots and lots of tells and you can just tell they love their hand, you don't want to bet this hand, right? So that is a reason to not bet in this spot. But in general, I think this is a pretty nice spot to continuation bet, because a lot of worse hands can call and your hand really needs protection. All right, check though. Turns a queen. Tom Dwan now bets 3,000. Okay. Seems like a spot where we have a pretty reasonable call. right? No point in raising. If we raise here, we're going to get called by every queen and every jack and every good draw. So that's not ideal. So easy call here. And the river is the 8 of diamonds. Not a great card at all, right? Notice in this scenario, now, if Tom Dwan did have a queen or a jack, he wins. If he had a random 8, like 10-8 or 9-8 or 10-9, all those hands have no showdown value on the turn that very likely would bet. So this is actually a really, really bad card. That said, there are still a few busted draws like the 7-4, 7-5, 5-4, random king high, random 10 high that decides to go for it. And Tom Dwan does decide to go for it. So does he have it or does he not? I don't know. This is actually a tough one. Man, I'm not going to say that you should fold here, but this 8 of diamonds is really, really, really bad, right? Because flush draws come in, straights and pairs come in. It is nice that Tom Dwan's betting bigger, like 8,000 into 10,000 here, because that's usually going to make him a little bit more polarized to good made hands and busted draws, or just garbage, right? If he bets smaller, like 4,000, I think it's even closer to a fold, because then you can be really confident he's betting like every jack and maybe even every 8. But when he bets this size, he's probably not betting the 8s, like 9-8. And he's probably also not betting the weak jacks, like jack 4 suited. So that's good. So in this scenario, what you want to have in your hand to call are cards that make it more difficult for Tom Dwan to have a very strong hand. So what are strong hands here? Well, flushes are strong, so we'd like to have a diamond to block that. So like in this scenario, 7 of diamonds, 6 of hearts would be a better hand to call with than 7 of spades, 6 of hearts, because when you have the 7 of diamonds, it's just a little bit less likely that Tom Dwan has a flush. You'd also like to have a 10 or a 9, because I think 10-9 would very likely bet the turn, and it would obviously bet the river using a polarized size, right? So you'd like to have a hand like 10-6 instead of a hand like 7-6, right? You also don't want to block the obvious bluffs. So what are the obvious bluffs? Well, 7-4, 7-5, and 5-4 all seem like pretty obvious bluffs to me. So you don't really want to have a 7, a 5, or a 4. So all of that considered, I think this 7-6 is actually a pretty bad hand to call with, because it blocks Tom Dwan's potential bluffs, and it also does not block his potential nuts. So for all those reasons, I think this is probably just a reasonable spot to fold. If, however, Phil Hellmuth had, let's say, 10 of diamonds, 6 of hearts, I think it'd be a pretty easy call. So what does Phil Hellmuth do? Does he use his white magical powers? Do they work for him again? What do you think? Is the suspense building? Are you excited? We have all the excitement here. You guys hear that alarm going off? I'm actually staying in upstate New York right now on a vacation with my family. And whenever there is a fire, they sound the alarm. Alarm bells should be going off in Phil Hellmuth's head right now. Let's see if it works for him. He calls, and he went. Oh, he loses. He loses to the 10-9. Sometimes the white magical powers do not work. I do want to point out, though, that this hand stems all the way back to the flop. If Phil Hellmuth just made a continuation bet, if he just bets 2,000 in this scenario, probably picks up the pot and moves on with his life. Instead, he let it go check. Tom Dwan got there, and he ended up winning a pretty nice pot. I will say, though, this is a scenario where maybe, just maybe, unless Tom Dwan gets there, he bluffs the river every time. And if Phil Hellmuth knows he's going to call the river every time, and Tom Dwan only gets there, well, when he gets a 10, 9, or 8, or a king, Phil Hellmuth's going to win this pot a lot of the time. It's a cool scenario, right? Where maybe, even though it didn't work out this time, it may not be quite as, we'll call it bad as it seems. Because if he wins, 70% of the time, and loses 30%, that's a deal you take every time. And maybe that's the situation he has set up. I'm not entirely sure. Go back and watch all the live footage on PokerGo. That's going to be it for today. Thanks again to Poker News for hosting this video. If you want your poker news, if you want all the poker news, check out pokernews.com. Good luck in your games. Have a great, great week. If you like this, click the like and subscribe buttons. I would appreciate it. And have fun. Hello there. Yeah, I'm talking to you. You want me to let you in on one little secret to take your poker skills to the next level? All you have to do is click the subscribe button right here. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
Very nice.